Welcome to Authors Revealed. I'm Becky Anderson. We are thrilled to have Charles Belfoure with his book, The Paris Architect. If you love thrillers from World War II that have to do with architecture and what was happening in Paris during Vichy France, this is the novel for you. Charles, welcome to Anderson's and Naperville.
Well, thank you for inviting me here.
Oh my gosh, we are so excited. I'm going to tell you, we have many booksellers in this store and our other store too that just love hand selling The Paris Architect. It's just one of their absolute favorite books. So I want to know, the book's been out for about 2 years now, just about, and in paperback for about a year. And knowing that this is your first novel that's out in the world, what have you heard from readers all this time? Because I think this book has gotten so much. We have book groups that love featuring this within their book groups. What are you hearing? I'm sure you hear many things, and since you put this out, this baby sort of out in the world,
Oh, yeah, well, like every week you get a few emails saying that,
Sure.
like how the book changed their lives, or they, really like the book. So you get emails from, like from Israel or from other countries where the book is been published. So, and these emails just pop up, telling you how much you like the book out of nowhere.
Right. And how many countries, how many different languages has Paris Architect now been published in? Do you know?
I think with Poland it was 11, and then a couple weeks ago we got the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. So maybe
fantastic.
that would be, I guess, 12 or some extra, 12, 13, or 14.
So the seed for this book, where did it start to grow? Where was the idea for you? Because you have published nonfiction, some architectural, and you do freelance writing for the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun. So where did that seed come from for this novel and this story?
Well, first I wanted to write novels that had architecture as the basis of the plot. So that was the first conceit for this thing. And then I'd stumbled across this historical fact about these priest holes in Elizabethan England, and that Catholicism was outlawed, and so priests could be arrested and executed for saying Mass. So they had to say Mass out in manor houses way out in the countryside. And these carpenters would design and build these intricate hiding places within the mansions. So if the place was raided by soldiers, they could just jump into the hole. Right. And it's a historical fact that the soldiers would rip the place up and they would never find the priests. They were hiding right under their noses. So I thought it was a pretty interesting idea, and I just transferred the idea to World War II, Paris.
Yeah. I've seen some of those in Scotland, some of the priest holes that are up there during the Jacobite, all that there was more priest holes that were built there were very interesting. So Lucien Bernard, your main character in this, is an architect. Is he based on part of you or anybody you've known? Because he's such an interesting character, and you see an incredible transformation that takes place throughout the course of this novel. But is there anybody, even maybe a professor or anybody that you've known over the years, that a little bit of him, that composite, is in this character?
No, I bet there's a little bit of me, because he wants to design at all costs. Right. So that's why he takes up the opportunity to design for the Germans, because he's just so desperate to design and to show what he can do. And an architect needs clients in order to show that they have talent and to get a building built. So that little bit of me is in him.
Right. And then, but the design, I think it's such a challenge for him, because it's sort of a two-part deal that he has to build a factory, but also to build these sort of intricate hiding places. So, I wanted to know what kind of research you did on that, because these hiding places are so incredible to read about when you describe them in the book, and all the different places, whether it was in a column or a fireplace or wherever you built these hiding places. Have you ever built one or seen one done, or is it all your architectural background?
It's just my architectural background. You would just think of where to hide someone that's reasonably easy to build, and they have to be able to access it quickly, jump in the hole quickly. So I just figured out the hiding places and designed them on the computer, because there was a little bit of guidance from the history on priest holes, but not a whole lot. So that was the inspiration. So then I just figured out, a few of them.
Yeah, yeah. Which was your favorite one? Because I loved the one that was on the column, which was so interesting.
I think the one that I liked the best was actually the simplest. It was in the kitchen on the ground floor, and there was a drain that had a fake pan filled with water.
Right.
So you could just pull the grating off, jump into the hole, and pull the grating back on top of you. And it just looked like, from the water there, it was just a regular floor drain. Yeah. And then there was a tunnel that went out.
Yeah, and that kind of reminded me of one of the priest holes I'd seen in Scotland, because it was in the floor and it was in the sort of the pantry kitchen area, which was very interesting. So this transformation that takes place with Lucien Bernard throughout the story, and at the beginning, he's very insensitive to the plight of what's happening to Jewish citizens in Paris, but then he's sort of anti-Semitic. But then you see how the story progresses, but you really laid that out real well. Was that hard to do, to have this transformation happening with your main character?
I wanted to that was one of the first ideas I had in terms of the character development. So I wanted to have him evolve over the novel like that. So right from the beginning, I wanted him to change, change like that.
Yeah, it was great to see what's happening to him. But Monsieur Monet, who is the one who talks to him, tell us about the deal that he has done and what he talks to Lucien about what he wants him to do.
Well, he asked Lucien to come to this apartment, and Lucien doesn't have any idea what he wants. He's hoping that it'll be some remodeling job or something. Right. And then Monet asks him, that it tells him that he wants him to design a hiding place, and for Jews, which is suicide, and Lucien doesn't want to do it. So, but then he offers him a large chunk of money, and Lucien is unemployed at this time, so he needs the money. Right. And then he gives him time to think about it, and so Lucien sort of thinks of it as a real challenge, because he hates the Germans. And so, so it's not just the cash that he's getting, it's the challenge of it. Right. And so it's not any humanistic kind of gesture. It's more of an architectural challenge that he wants to be able to pull off. So, and Monet will hide these people in these apartments, and if they have to go into these hiding places if the place is raided, and then he takes them and whisks them out of the country to Spain or Portugal, or into Switzerland. So
how much research did you do? Because this is like 1942. This is Vichy Paris. What's happening? I think. Did you go over to Paris and do that? That would have been a fun research trip.
Yeah,
but did you do?
People ask me that all the time. Yeah. So no, I went before.
Oh,
and I didn't go when I was writing the book, but I was familiar with the neighborhoods and everything. Yeah. So I just got books on occupied Paris and just to understand what everyday life was like. There's the fear. People didn't have enough to eat. It was just a very gloomy time in Paris, and so because I thought the Germans, would basically win the war, and they would be, under their hold, for a long, long time.
I read about your mom and how interesting as a Polish immigrant, but what happened to her. And having to work in some labor camps during World War II. Tell us about her experience, and how much of that experience of hers informed part of this book.
Well, she had been working. The Germans conscripted, all people of all nationalities that they had conquered, into factories to work for them. For either a little pay or no pay at all. So she was working in a factory. And because she could speak fluent German, she got a break when a plant supervisor, said that he could get her a job as a translator and a housekeeper for this guy who was a contractor in Nordhausen. He was tunneling out the Harz Mountains, where they were building the facilities where you would build the V-2 rockets, the first guided missiles. So she had gotten a job just through happenstance, and so that was her experience. But I was at a synagogue a couple weeks ago in Baltimore, and giving a talk, and this old man, he must have been in his 90s, and he was a friend of my mother's, and I remember this guy.
Gee.
So when I was talking, he said, well, your mother hit a Jew. And I said, well, I didn't know that. And the woman passed away, and so they had to contact the Jewish police in Krakow so they could get her body out and give her a Jewish funeral. So my mother never ever talked about that. And so this old man told me something I had never heard of before.
Wow.
And they were very close friends too. My mother died about 10 years ago. So this guy must have been in his 90s, and he was a very confidant with my mother, so she would have maybe told him something like that.
Yeah, but she never told you about that. That's
No, she rarely talked about the war.
The big experience, yeah.
If you asked her outright, she might talk about it a little
about
bit.
But yeah, probably a lot of hard things she saw, I'm sure. But she came and then became, she got her master's in French at Middlebury, but then taught German and Spanish and French at the high school level. So,
So she came to America as a displaced person. So, and so she didn't go back to Poland because it became communist. So, so she just had to make a new life for herself here.
Yeah. So before this novel, you had published other books, in architecture and talking about, I think you did a book on the row houses in Baltimore. And then the other book, the history of bank architecture, which I always have found so interesting. So what was it like switching gears and moving to fiction? And it's sort of like when you think about how a building is put together and the structure of it and the support structure and everything. Is some of that similar for you when you were switching to a novel and plotting out, what happens in a story, the outline and sort of that skeletal part of it?
I found it a lot easier than writing nonfiction because you don't have to. You may have to do research, but you don't have to footnote the research. You don't have to gather all kinds of illustrations and everything. There's a lot of work involved in these books. So I found it a lot easier just to think up stuff in my imagination and just put it on the computer. And although you had to do some research, it wasn't the same task as writing nonfiction. And then what you do is, in terms of being a similar process to architecture, is that you do a structure, a skeleton, and then you just fill it in. And the skeleton is just basically the premise of the book.
And do you outline pretty strictly, or when you're writing, and do some things surprise you as it does when we're reading them?
I don't outline, and I just start writing, and then stuff surprises me, and I think about different plot twists and everything. That's sort of the pleasurable thing about it. I discovered in writing the books is that all of a sudden you think of different plot lines and different characters and everything. They just come about. So, and I don't know whether I'd be able to do that if I tried to outline the thing. So I just let it come as it may.
Yeah. And I love to hear that when authors talk like that, because it's so fresh for us, because it is for you when you're initially writing it too. So I think that's really exciting. But I think with historical fiction, and it's interesting how what we do as booksellers, we always go back to those classic historical fiction, and this is one of those types of books. But there is something about filling in the gaps of history with that emotion. And I think that's what The Paris Architect does. And I think with your new book, which we'll talk about, it does for New York City, during that Gilded Age and that sort of thing. So do you sort of feel like that maybe you got a different picture, as being a preservationist and looking at a building and you see the strict history of it, but when you know the people that lived in it, those emotional stories behind it, it just makes it a much fuller picture?
Yeah, you look at these buildings, and then you can't help but think of the occupants over the years. So in fiction writing, you would start to think of plot lines of, what their stories would be like, and what kind of characters would be there. Think of some interesting thing, and it would be part of the story.
In this book, there were some other great characters besides Lucia, but Father Jacques and Herzog and Monet and Colonel Schlegel. There were some really interesting characters that made up the other parts of this book. Was there a particular additional character besides Lucia that you really liked?
I didn't know that French priests hid Jewish children, so I created the old priest, and I liked him a lot. He wasn't in the book a whole lot, but I liked his character a lot. And he was probably my favorite character.
The other thing too that was interesting about Lucien, you see this transformation, how he things really start to affect him, and he, the emotional toll that takes on him. But then his buy-in to what he needs to do to be this compassionate and courageous person. But he's such an interesting character because as an architect, and wanting to that challenges of building something, but he also is very pragmatic. He's a rational type of guy, very interesting. So it was you really showed a lot of aspects of his character, and did you sit down to really kind of sort of do a description of him before you set out to write this story?
No, I just thought from the beginning he wasn't such a sympathetic character, and that he would evolve and sort of develop a sense of humanity. I mean, he wouldn't become a saint, but he would just change over the course of the novel, and that was the plot line for him.
Yeah, you really don't like him at the beginning of the book. You really don't. So a lot of this people have compared you to Ken Follett, and the one book that stands out for me because it's more about architecture is The Pillars of the Earth, and thinking about that. But these other thrillers, with his World War II thrillers, that's a pretty cool compliment to be compared to somebody like Ken Follett.
Yeah, that was very complimentary. Sort of embarrassing, but
no.
But it just happened to be a World War II book. It I just sort of stumbled on that. Yeah. So the premise for all these books is architecture, and it can be set at any time. So I don't necessarily write World War II thrillers.
Yeah, right. So there was a scene that I heard that you cut from the book, and it had to do with graveyards. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you cut it out of the story?
The Jews would hide anywhere they could because they were so desperate, especially if they waited too long. They didn't escape the country. So caretakers in graveyards would dig a grave, deep, maybe deeper, and they would put planks over the grave and mound it up with earth, and people would actually live in the grave, 2 or 3 people, and there would be a pipe up there for air, and then there was a way to move a plank or something to give food and water, and take a slop bucket out. So you can't have so many characters in the book because it hurts the pacing of the book. So he had to go. So that was an editorial decision to chop him. So in the whole process of writing fiction, you have to be ready to chop stuff out, and sometimes it's hard, and sometimes you put up a fight, but it's important to keep the pace of the book moving along.
So talking about editing, and your publisher is Source Books, which is right here in Naperville, and your editor, tell us about working with Source Books, and I think your editor, you credit her in the background in your acknowledgments. Right.
When you sell the manuscript, your literary agent sells the manuscript to a publishing house, you think it's perfect. You think it's so great. And then what happens is that the publishing house's editorial director will say, we really love your book. But then they'll email you all these editorial comments, things that they think that should be changed or clarified. And at first you're sort of miffed by it. Then you kind of gather your wits, and then you say, well, wait a minute, these suggestions make the book better. So working with the editor at Source Books, Shana Dreys, she helped lift the book to another level, a higher level. And so that's what I was very indebted to her, because all her comments were well-founded, and they all made the book a lot better.
Right. I think people forget that process takes place. It's not just sitting down and writing, but of what a publisher can do to help you craft a better book.
Yeah, every writer needs an editor.
Right. So you've been a professor, or you've taught at the Pratt Institute and Goucher College. Tell us about what you do, and what do you tell your students when it comes to architecture?
Well, I don't teach anymore.
Oh, you don't, but when you did, and if you could teach writing, what were some of those advice that you gave to some of your students?
Oh, when I taught architecture, or I taught like site planning, which is important for architects, because the building has to be placed on a plot of ground, and so I took a very practical approach. I hated theoretical professors, and I wanted to give the students a more practical grounding. So when they went out to look for a job, they had some real practical knowledge that they could use, in doing the building. Because the first step is to put the building on a piece of land and to decide where it's going to go. So I was very, very intent on giving them knowledge, imparting knowledge to them that would help them in a professional, practical way.
Yeah. So I want to talk about your new book that's coming out, and it's coming out September 15th, I think is the release date. So House of Thieves. Now this is set in New York, but of course your main character is also an architect. So without any spoilers, can you tell us about this book and all the pieces you put together to make this story?
Well, to pay off his son's gambling debts, a society architect in 1886, New York, is forced to join a criminal gang and plan robberies of the buildings he's designed, all in order to pay off his son's gambling debts, or they'll kill his son.
Ah, wow. Well, that grabs you right away. So the kind of research you must have done on this, because I'm assuming the architect is getting into big mansions or museums or other things where he knows the architecture and he can help get them in. So did you do some research on anything in New York, or did you already have that knowledge that you felt you could base a lot of?
Well, I went to school in New York, so I knew all about
Right.
the architecture of the Gilded Age, and that was my favorite period there.
Okay.
And so I basically stumbled across an historical fact about this character named George Leslie, who had come from the Midwest to settle in New York to practice as an architect, and he gave up the practice because he'd rather be a criminal and plan bank robberies. It was just more challenging and I guess far more lucrative.
So this is the character is based on this person you found.
Yeah, it was a real life person. There's not much known about him.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's so fascinating. So what in New York? What is your favorite Gilded Age building? What would you say is your favorite building there?
It's hard to say that. First of all, there's not that many of them left, and so the ones that I have in the book are basically have all been torn down. So there really isn't much left in New York City, major buildings like that.
Do you feel the whole, and I know you've been involved in preservation for a long time, but do you feel like the preservation movement has finally stopped some of the destruction of so many, significant buildings in our country? Or you think there needs to be a lot more effort put into saving?
No, I think in America after the Second World War, there was absolutely no regard or appreciation of historic architecture. And then starting in the 1980s, there was a preservation movement, and it's gained momentum in the last 30-some years. So I think it's here to stay, and I think that people want to save buildings. I mean, sometimes when a developer or something owns a building or a piece of property, it's more lucrative for him to knock it down and to build something else. You're always going to have those types of situations.
Right.
So, but the preservation movement is really, I think, strong in the United States.
That's great. That's great, because when I think of Chicago, some of the buildings that were lost, a number of years ago, it's really sad to think those buildings are gone. So Charles, I end these interviews with a little quiz.
Okay.
No pressure. You know all the answers, so
Okay.
it's sort of a lightning round. So whatever comes to you first. Do you remember a favorite book when you were young?
Curious George.
Good one. Do you remember a favorite architect that you liked to study when you were at the Pratt Institute? If there's anyone that stands out for you?
It was a late 19th century architect named Henry Hobson Richardson.
Did you ever, when you were in high school or anything, ever faked reading a book? Because I think all of us have done at least one.
Yeah, I would, especially if there was a movie out on it, or you see it on TV, you would pretend.
Sure. What is one of your favorite buildings that you love to go revisit and just go through? Any particular historic building that you absolutely love?
Well, in Baltimore, there's the first Catholic cathedral by Benjamin Henry Latrobe. It's a huge building, a dome building. So I like going in there. I just like the space, and a few years ago they put it back the way it was originally designed. So that would probably be the overall number one building.
Okay. Okay, how about a book, any book you've read? It could have been something to do with your career or whatever. A book that you've been an evangelist for? Anything you've read or anything you could not tell enough people they had to read?
It's called The Power Broker. It's about Robert Moses.
Oh, okay.
I thought that was the best biography I've ever written, that I've ever read.
And anything you're reading now, and when you're writing, like I don't know if the next book is done, I'm sure, but when you're writing, do you try and avoid reading other fiction, or certain types? Like some authors don't like to read other people's fiction when they're writing their own book.
The only fiction writer that I've read consistently is Ann Tyler, because she's from Baltimore.
Okay,
Because
right.
I always like the references to Baltimore, and that's what interested me in there. But she really is very observant of human nature, the way people act, with one another, and so she has a real gift, for writing about that. So I have been reading on and off her last book. I think it's A Spool of Blue Thread. So
right,
I haven't finished that yet, and then I'm working on a third book. So then what I do is I read, I do the research. So that's what I'm reading now.
So can you tell us what that third one, maybe a little, what it might be about?
It's set in 1905 England, and again, it's about an architect, and it's sort of set in the world of British music halls.
Oh,
so
wow.
I do the research on these music halls and what types of acts and the actors and the performers and that type of thing.
Oh.
So I want to get that world into the book.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, Charles, thank you so much for sitting and talking to me. And please promise that you'll come back
Yes,
when
I'll
the
come.
House of Thieves comes out.
I can come back in the fall here.
Okay, that would be fantastic.
Because
So
I like
thank
to
you.
visit Chicago and look at the architecture
Yes, great city for that. Well, thank you so much.
here. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you. Great conversation with Charles Belfoure and his book, The Paris Architect. You've got to read this one if you love great historical fiction. You can't wait to read every page. It'll keep you up all night. Thanks for joining me on Authors Revealed.